Welcome to Industrial Design History. These images should give you a sense of where we're going to go this semester. It's really, really broad. It's a lot of information. It's 4,000 images. I know that it's too much for anyone to remember, but I also know that it's not enough, that I will be blamed by people for not including the things that matter to you. You've come to this class with an expectation. The gearheads in the crowd will be angry that I don't do cars better. The engineers will find fault that I'm not explaining how things work correctly. People who are interested in theory will be upset that I don't even understand theory. I just talk about how things are. So keep in mind that this is meant to work for everyone. It's broad. It's an introduction. But also keep in mind that the lectures are meant to pair with readings that have a lot more information about that stuff, with research project and with conversations. With all those puzzle pieces put together, you should have access to a really good foundational body of information to help you find the things you want more of and also help to find the things you don't want. So you might not want to be hearing all the things we're going to talk about this semester, but they will all help you in forming your idea of what you do want your path to be as a designer. I have 3 quotations I want to share with you because they help explain where I'm coming from in formulating this class. Byron, whom I've never read, said, "The best prophet of the future is the past." And I love this because for me it conjures the image of a train. There's a trajectory. The track goes from there to there, and you're on the train in the middle. If you look out the back, you can see where you've been. If you look out the front, you can see where you're going, and those things are attached. History gives us a sense of the trajectory and speed that we've been on, and as a result will help us predict where we're going better. I see that we're living in a world that really wants dramatic change fast, immediately, and I understand those desires, but if you change direction too completely or too quickly, the train's going to get derailed. So as someone who looks at history to help inform my own direction, I'm aware that it helps create a link and a path. And it helps keep me humble about my expectations. Another quotation I like, I actually got from the wall of a local coffee shop. The great Eleanor Roosevelt wrote, "Learn from the mistakes of others. You can't live long enough to make them all yourself." And for me, I love that because so many people don't want to know about history. They just want to start with a fresh palette and their incredible genius will lead them to success. And I just feel like, what a waste of time. People already did everything wrong, and you could avoid doing it wrong yourself if you just spent some time looking at that. For me, that's the whole goal. How can I work faster and smarter and save myself some time? Another quotation I like is on the side of the John Carter Brown Library here in Providence, carved by Nick Benson when the building was extended in the 1990s, the early 90s, I think. And it is a library version of a Bible verse. The Bible says, "Speak to the earth and it shall teach thee." But this library says, "Speak to the past and it shall teach thee." And I looked at this for probably a decade before I actually thought about it. I love this. It doesn't say listen to the past, read about the past, watch about the past on the History Channel. It says speak to it. Engage in an active discourse with the past. So don't just listen to the stuff I'm going to say or look at the pictures I have up on the screen this semester. Ask questions of me, of it, Google stuff, find out stuff. It's only by actively engaging in a push and pull with the things you find from the past that you're going to be able to use it. I feel weirdly and wrongly that I need to justify why you should even study history as a designer. And I think that's because I get a lot of pushback from students who feel like it might not be as useful as learning some new skill or getting CAD figured out. The reality is, I think it's the most important skill because one of the foundational requirements for good design work is empathy. You need to be able to understand the people for whom you're designing. You can never be them, but you can get closer to understanding their motivations and their needs and their concerns through empathy. Here's a clumsy illustration of that. This is some entitled little kid having his iPhone taken away by dad, and probably he's about to have a meltdown because it's the worst thing that could happen all day. But if that child had lived in England any time between the first chimney was invented and 1846, when labor laws were changed, and if that child were small enough, that child would have been a chimney sweep, crawling up and down inside chimneys all day, one of the most miserable existences a child has ever had on this planet. That's way worse than an iPhone being taken away, right? And it's pretty easy to laugh at that 2019 kid and just write him off as an entitled little brat. But the reality is he doesn't know anything else. And that's where history is valuable to me. By learning more about what has happened and other circumstances and how we treated each other and what we expected of life, I have a better understanding of what I can expect in my own life and what I can achieve with my own time. I updated this slide for this year because you could play this forward into today's situation by looking at Philip and Barbara Loomis in California in 1918, struggling to understand why they needed to wear cloth face masks to avoid getting sick from the flu epidemic. So for me, certainly, even the frustrations of being alive today in the middle of what we're going through can be lessened or explained or contextualized by learning more about history. Also, to go back to Eleanor Roosevelt's point, I started making face masks for myself and had to go through a whole bunch of prototypes to figure it out because I'm stupid, I didn't think to look backwards. If you're going to talk about face masks, you could really easily use history to show you how many ways there have been figured out to match fabric to our own human faces in 1918 and before. Also, the picture on the right shows you that the jerks who refuse to obey public health guidelines have also been around for a really long time. That might help me have a little bit of patience for the people I keep yelling at when I leave my house. And I know we're only 8 slides into this class and I'm already going off-roading, but I really want to just give you one slide about Sarah Little Turnbull because she fits in today's moment so beautifully. This isn't really part of the intro to this class, except maybe kind of it is. How can she not be here? Sarah Little Turnbull designed the N95 face mask. So did you even realize that the N95 was designed by an early female industrial designer? She started Sarah Little Design Consultancy in 1958 when she left her job as an editor at House Beautiful. And she was short, she was 4'11", so she really understood how designers were not paying attention to the people they were designing for because the built world was always at odds with her own needs and expectations. She worked with General Mills and Corning Glass, but her time at 3M is sort of interesting. They hired her because they wanted a female designer to help them figure out how to make gift wrap out of their new non-woven plastic that they were experimenting with. They thought, oh, we want pretty stuff, we'll get a lady designer. And she arrived and blew the lid off the whole equation and said, this is useful for so many things you're not thinking about. In the fashion industry, it can be used for interfacing, for shoulder pads, for brassieres. Brassiere, what a funny word, for bras. And they kept her on, and her work on the bra led to her in 1958 developing a removable liner, and she realized that that could also work as a filtering mechanism, a face mask. So many of the things that are crucial to make our face masks today work are introductions that Sarah Little Turnbull gave us. The metal nose clip, the elastic band, the non-woven material, and the shape were all things she introduced. The material didn't end up being a good enough filter for pathogens that it would work for medical uses, so it was introduced in 1961 as a dust mask. And in 1994, 3M invented a better material for filtering, and we got the N95. She also had something to do with the design of the bugle, that classic snack, but I can't get all the specifics. I can't figure out the story. Sarah Little used to say that she never invented anything, she only made improvements. And that's one of the reasons I feel it's okay to stick her in here, because that's what I want to focus on right now. This idea that there is no such thing as a genius who sits down and invents a mask. There's incremental collective progress. Another thing I stuck in, because it's related to where we are right now, is looking backwards at the history of germs and viruses and how they shape our experience on the planet. We can go back way further than this year or 1918. And we can probably go back farther than I am as well, but I just have a couple of things I want to bring into the conversation. In 1520, when Cortez arrived in Mexico, the illustrations that were produced by Westerners and the illustrations that have been produced since by historians and illustrators show that as like a fun party, like, yay, we're meeting new people. The drawing on the right shows the reality of what happened, which is that Cortez arrived with European smallpox, which the Aztecs had no resistance to. Between 50,000 and 300,000 people died, making it really easy for the Spaniards to take over with a very small army. The same thing happened when Europeans arrived in North America. As much as 90% of the estimated 18 million Native American inhabitants died. One of the things that came over with the Europeans were rats in the hold of the ship, and they carried diseases that pretty much decimated the Native American population. The Boston Harbor Island was pretty much cleared of inhabitants by the 1616 plague, making Massachusetts much easier to colonize. In fact, they had already planted the corn. And here in Rhode Island, the Narragansett tribe was decimated by smallpox in 1633, reducing the population to under 5,000. The King of England, King James, decided that it was God in action clearing the land for him and his people. Isn't ID history fun? Isn't this good? Why am I including this? I know you came here for like statement teapots and sports cars, and what am I doing talking about pestilence and death? I feel like there's a part of this class which needs to take on global conversations, but doesn't as much as I'd like. And this is one way to sort of point out how foundational global exchange is. So I started by talking about the global exchange of germs because I feel like it relates to what we're going through now with COVID-19. It's not new. This is the price we pay for globalization. Anything we catch will spread easier than it did with oceans separating our immune systems. And that's part of design in today's world where global systems are part of everything. But in addition to smallpox and bubonic plague and chickenpox and cholera and yellow fever and COVID-19, interacting with other cultures has always been a really important part of how we make things. If you were King Tut in 1300 BC and you needed to express your power and your wealth with lapis lazuli, one of the most precious materials, you had to send someone to Afghanistan to get it because that's the only place on the planet where lapis lazuli comes from. That's true of most precious materials. Garnets come from Sri Lanka and India. Amethysts come from India. Emeralds come from India and later Colombia. Turquoise, jade, they're all regional materials. And that's true in today's world still. All of the rare earth magnets that we use in so many things are mined in China. So keep this in mind. The global aspect to manufactured items is really old, and it's a part of every conversation whether we can find a way to tease it out and bring it to the surface or not. As we focus more throughout the semester on industrialization, the story becomes more Western and more biased. But that doesn't mean that the story isn't actually a global one. And I want to talk about that more because everything about this class is fraudulent. And if we were meeting in person, we'd talk about what that word means. It means fake, wrong. I'm telling you a story that rests on a pedestal, which is constructed by the written histories, by the museum collections, by the published books. It doesn't mean that that's the only story or the right story. It's just the story we have to tell. So I want to talk about several ways this class is fraudulent. This is like apologizing in advance that you won't like your birthday present, and I'm sorry. Throughout history, progress came in fits and spurts. Different cultures, different geographies, different places on the planet were charging forward and innovating while others were not. If you go all the way back to 3000 BC, really exciting stuff was happening in Egypt, in India, in China. Not so much elsewhere. If we move up to 100, when the Romans were conquering and unifying and building their stabilized empire, which is where a lot of histories wrongly start, we credit the Romans with all of this sort of progress, but there was just as much or more progress still happening in China and in India. If we move up to 1200, when Europe was plunged into an era of ignorance and religious crusades, the golden age of Middle East engineering was happening, and China and India were still doing just great, thank you very much. So where stuff starts to get more Western biased is with industrialization. The story will become more about Britain and America, and Europe as well, because industrialization happened there in a more radical and focused way. China, Korea did end up industrializing, but later. Japan industrialized a little sooner than they did, but it was because they were forced to. So that story of how industrialization happened is a big part of this class, which is an industrial design history. And I think students often lose track of that and want to see more of things in this story that aren't part of this story, which doesn't mean we can't get them in. It just means we have to manufacture the method of doing that. We have to rebuild the pedestal the story is sitting on. And that continues past industrialization. In 1880, all the important innovation was happening in Germany: internal combustion, the chemical industry, scientific and engineering innovations, all in Germany. If we continue on to 1950, plastics were being explored in Italy before everywhere else, or in a richer way than everywhere else. And that's the innovation hub. So my point is just that over time, there's no one place that was smarter or better. Everyone has had a share in this story. It's just changed over time. This class will be looking at a section in time, which forces us to look at a geographical section as well. So I want to do my best to expand that bigger, but keep in mind that there's other times and other things happening and other histories and other disciplines. So a little bit of why this class is fraudulent is because we're studying a profession. Here's my thinking about how the story will change, because it needs to change. My parents' generation in the 1950s grew up with this promise of a perfect future. If you get married, have a good job, stay at that job till you die, have 2 kids, 2.5 kids, a car in the garage, that's the American dream, you can do it. Then they got married and had 2 kids and realized this isn't a dream of any kind. Or they realized this is a dream, but for a tiny group of people. All these other people aren't part of this promise. So the promise, the story, the narrative was wrong. And that generation fought against that. They protested, they organized, and they demanded a different world. And then my generation grew up in the shadow of that, watching that happen. So I've grown up aware that the story's wrong, but unable to do anything about it because we don't have the tools to tell the story differently. Museums have collections that are photographed, so if you want to use a picture of a thing, it's probably going to be from a book and a museum collection. You probably can't use a picture of something that hasn't been photographed or collected or was thrown away. Most of the written histories were written by the designers who started the profession, who are all men. That doesn't mean there weren't women there. Their stories haven't been told. So my generation has been trying to identify all the underrepresented people who were active in building design history and haven't been getting credit for it, and write books about them. We've also been trying to re-examine how we tell the story. Maybe instead of talking about the designer, we talk about the consumer, which for centuries has been mostly women. So women had the single most important voice in why things look the way they do and what was being made. They just haven't been given credit for creating it. So we're doing a lot of work to get the tools to do this all differently. So it's not just dead white guys with stuff at the MoMA. But my plea is actually to my students to realize that instead of being frustrated that you don't see yourself in this story and thinking it's because stupid teacher doesn't know how to do it better, have a little patience, because it's actually your job to change it. You are the first generation that has both the awareness that the story is wrong and the tools to change the story. So we're working on it. Like with the train metaphor, it's slow and takes time, and it's easy to understand how frustrating that is. But we're making progress. Another reason this class is totally fraudulent is that partly because of what I just said, partly because we're relying on objects in museums that have become the things people want to look at, we will be focusing a lot on fancy stuff for rich people, or even worse, on prototypes or one-offs or super expensive experimental things. And part of that problem is I can blame on my students because they want to see this stuff. If I don't show Werner Panton's chair, people get angry at me. I would love to be able to teach this class with the forgotten things, the Stop-At spray deodorant bottle from 1947, the M&M from 1930, the crochet hook from 1873. There are so many great things we could use to tell the story of industrialization and industrial design, but there aren't published sources for that. There's no information, there's no images, and so I can't. Another reason this class is really fraudulent is that it celebrates, in spite of all my efforts, the cult of the genius. Most people think if you're a good designer, you sit with your sketchbook and you have great ideas and you change the world, or else you're just stupid and you don't. In fact, there's no such thing as one person who changed the world with an innovation. This class is forced to celebrate the cult of genius because we need to throw names at you and learn those names, when in fact we should be celebrating collective progress. So we all know that Edison invented the light bulb. Duh, that's just true. But did he? In 1802, Humphrey Davy connected wires to a battery and made the first incandescent light. Probably not even the first incandescent light, just the first one that got recorded. In 1820, Warren de la Rue added a vacuum chamber to extend the life of the filament. In 1840, William Grove used water to seal that vacuum and extend its life, and added platinum as a filament, and was able to light an entire theater with artificial light. This was the first time artificial incandescent light was actually useful, although it was still way too expensive to use for anything. In 1841, Frederick de Morlan's got the first patent for a light bulb, and that's where innovation really took off, because a patent is a published record where people could read about it and understand the technology and then play with it on their own. And we saw people start inventing light bulbs in Germany and in Russia. Heinrich Goebel introduced the carbonized bamboo filament secured in a glass container that became the actual foundation for the practical light bulb. And then finally, in 1879 in England, Joseph Swann invented the light bulb, and in 1880 in New Jersey, Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. They both produced practical incandescent bulbs with long-burning carbonized filaments in a glass vacuum tube. So who invented the light bulb? Kind of doesn't matter. We say that Edison did, and we say that because he might not have invented the light bulb, but he figured out how to produce them affordably and then connect them to a system that made them useful. So Edison got the light bulb in people's houses. That's why we say he invented it. But in terms of understanding innovation and designers and innovators, it was a team effort. History favors the lone genius, but reality requires decades and casts of thousands to bring innovation into real life. I also want to point out that Edison bought all of the bamboo that he used for his filaments from one farm in Japan. So there's one forgotten Japanese farmer who provided the functioning component of every light bulb that Edison made for decades. So is that Japanese farmer not also part of the story of how the light bulb was invented? Years ago, I made a chart, and I love making charts because they're always terrible. There's always a flaw. This chart is very flawed. But the point of this chart was that industrial design as a profession started around 1927, and theoretically is still going today, although I would argue it's turning into multiple other things. But all the components of the profession existed long before. So throughout history, we had materials. We used glass or metal or wood, and we made things for ourselves or for other people, and we sold them or we traded them. All the things that we do as industrial designers existed before, but they were sort of separate. It wasn't until 1927 that they tightened together enough that we could hold it and name it and call it industrial design. So my thinking is that now that rope of different things is unraveling and turning into experience design and interface design and separating out, which is exciting to get to see. The problem with this chart is that it's not temporal. 1930 to 1990 is temporal, but what is the stuff that happened before? What's this innovation cloud before that? So before I started teaching this class, I attached this to an actual time chart, and the story completely changed. That's one thing I love about numbers. You can look at them differently and they tell you a different story. This is actually what that chart should look like, because those older innovations, it turns out, are really, really old. And then there's this steady pace of innovation as things added in a sort of incremental way until this explosion at the end. And this explosion at the end told me a few things. One, it gave me a sort of homework list of all the things that I felt I needed to get up to speed on to be able to teach this class. But it also told me that there's a story to be investigated and told about why this happened. Also, I think it points out that we need some constraints. Like, what even is industrial design? If it goes back to 3000 BC and had an explosion in 1750, how are we going to put some constraints around this? So if we were live in class, we'd have a conversation about what each of you might want industrial design to be. Because right now, the reality is almost every student of industrial design has a different idea about what it needs to be than everyone else. And I'm old and have a really out-of-date idea of this, and students generally are pretty frustrated that I don't see it the way they do. So I want to leave room in this class, it's one reason it's so broad, for everybody to recognize their own definition of industrial design in what we're doing. But I also want to explain my thinking about what I'm considering industrial design, because it will help explain the constraints of the class and the way I've constructed it. You're not stuck with my definition. I just want you to know what I was thinking about. And I think by explaining what I was thinking about, it might help sort of fuel your own thinking a little bit. Some things to consider for this are whether or not industrial design involves mass production. For me, it does. Industrial design is producing things that are made in repeat. So clearly a Coca-Cola bottle no human hand is involved in making that. That's mass production. But that idea of factory manufacturing can be broadened. This is a famous image of a chicken processing factory in China, but it is an image that looks very much like many other factories around the world, because the truth is that we don't have a lot of things that are made entirely by machine without human participation. Most factories have assembly lines where people are putting stuff together. Your iPhone is really a craft project. Someone was working on that at some point. So is this still mass production? If people are actually doing it, we just don't see them. If you say that's okay, the moving assembly line is the difference, where the work has all been rationalized and teased out. So it's not craft. When does that start? The moving assembly line goes back to 1914, 1918, 1920. These people are just doing the same thing over and over again. They're not thinking about it. So they are really just machines. They're just power sources. I always like the game of peeling something back another layer and saying, but when did that start? And for me, ancient Chinese bronze vessels are a really rewarding thing to look at, because they look like a handmade craft object. But a lot of the thinking about how to make them involves the same thinking about mass production. The bowl on the left has a stamped decoration. The decoration is stamped into the mold before casting. And you've all done this, or you can imagine this. You're applying a decoration and you get back to the starting point and you either have a gap or an overlap. Well, these molds were made in a standard size to match the decorative blocks, which were made in a corresponding standard size so that the pattern would always work out. The piece on the right is made with a very complicated multi-part mold. These objects were changed to suit the manufacturing processes that created them. And for me, that's the foundation of mass manufacturing, when the object has to be created for the way it will be made. And I think you could even go back farther if you were desperate to, which I am. These Egyptian funerary collars are glass beads, and I don't think a craftsperson made one bead and then the next day made the next bead. I think they found efficiencies, ways to roll out the glass and make all the white beads at once. So, I don't know, I wasn't there, but I love looking for evidence of that brain power of how could I do this faster or better. I think that's one of the foundational parts of mass manufacturing, and it's in evidence all the way at the beginning. But if you don't agree with that, that's fine. You could also say, no, it has to have steel and a power source. A Heidelberg printing press takes information and ink and smacks it on paper a gazillion times a minute, and that's mass manufacturing. But that's using ancient technology. You could go back to Gutenberg and his press, but you could go back way farther to Chinese printing presses and Japanese woodblock prints, and it's just a different power source or a different surface that the information's on, but the actual concept of how to transfer information from one original source to multiples is the same. You could also decide it's not the manufacturing that matters in my definition, it's the conception of the object that matters. Our Department of Industrial Design at RISD has traditionally been a user-centric design department. We focus on the person we're designing for, their limitations, their abilities, their interests. The Aeron chair is a great example. Its shape is defined by what it has to do, where it meets a human being, and the measurements and the positioning of that human body. We think of that, the study of ergonomics and anthropometrics, as something very recent, starting in World War II and really getting perfected once we got computers, so in the 1990s. But the basic premise is ancient. These are presentation saddles. They're designed on the inside to fit a horse, on the top surface to fit a human butt, and those shapes are crafted by understanding those human-centered constraints. For me, that's a big part of what industrial design is and what it needs to always be. But however you end up defining industrial design, there are some categories that matter, especially to this class. So I just want to go through the different categories of stuff that I have to make sure get included in this class. The most obvious one would be people. There are just people involved in this process that you guys need to know about. You should know Buckminster Fuller. I think you should know Eileen Gray and Eva Zeisel. You probably want to know about Christopher Dresser. So we'll get a bunch of people in there, the names you need to know. There also are objects that you should know, whether you learn about the person who made them or not. In fact, Michael Tonnett, who made the famous Tonnett chair, all designers love that chair and look at it and understand it. But not that many of us know anything about Michael Tonnett. He's sort of disappeared as an important person, and the chair has taken his place. I'd love for you to know Kenji Ekuon, who designed the Kikkoman soy sauce bottle, but the reality is there are some objects that you just should know that help tell the story of industrial design. One of the reasons I like teaching at RISD is that it lets me talk way more about the materials, how things are made and what they're made of. I believe that that's the single most important part of why things look the way they do. Materials control form and shape, and materials allow different shapes and surfaces. And so the relationship between what an object looks like and how it's made is a really important part of this story for me. There are also some interesting opportunities to just look at what was happening in the world and how it related to design. So when Howard Carter discovered King Tut's tomb in 1922, and the pictures went around the world and everybody saw Egyptian stuff, mostly for the first time, they went crazy. The Egyptian revival of the 1920s was complete. Everything that was made in 1925 referenced Egypt in some way. In the late 1970s, when Star Wars came out and all the interiors were white, and Saturday Night Fever came out with its polyester and coke-fueled extravagance, there was a trend in design to make things white. So there are just relationships between stuff and culture and design, and I want to look at those. I will do a bad job talking about politics because I don't know history all that well, but there's a really tight relationship between war and design, and it's sad to talk about, but we are at our smartest when someone's trying to kill us. So during wars, we are super innovative and get new materials and new technologies. And then after the war, it is designers who swoop in to figure out how to repurpose all of that for peacetime progress. So we'll look at both the innovation and then what it led to. We also want to look at education, and by that I mean how we taught designers, so starting schools like RISD and Cranbrook and the Bauhaus to train designers, but also how the world discovered design through exhibitions, through global world's fairs. The picture on the lower right, I just want you to look at for a second because I spent so long waiting for this picture, trying to find it for you. That's a picture of Peter Müller-Munk on the left, one of the early industrial design professors at Carnegie Institute. And on the right, the very first person to get a degree in industrial design in America. And it's a woman named Maud Bowers-Rice, who was an emigre from the Philippines. So the very first person to get an industrial design degree in America was a female immigrant. I don't know why I want you to know that. It isn't actually important, but I feel like when we're trying to identify more women in design history, where are all the women in design history? It would be wrong to not, in some small way, celebrate that fact. I also want to talk about different design styles because you will be in a position as a designer where someone says you need to reference the Art Nouveau or it should have an arts and crafts flavor. I resent those kinds of layers, but it happens and you need to know those references. I also want to distinguish styles from movements. A style is what something looks like. A movement is why it exists. So the arts and crafts style is rough-hewn boards and honest joints that are exposed. But the arts and crafts movement is trying to find ways that the worker can have a better quality of life while making the objects. It was a response to industrialization. So it's a subtle distinction, but I think it's worth talking about. If we revisit this timeline for a little while, I just want to point out that the title I have for this is Cool Stuff Happened a Long Time Ago. Is it industrial design? No, we didn't have a profession yet. Is it engineering? Probably not. But all the things that I identified as mattering to me in defining industrial design are in evidence in 3000 BC. So formulate your definition of industrial design and hold it against some of the things I want to show you in this timeline. Innovation is really old. Toothbrushes are 3000 BC. We invented the wheel to turn ceramic pots before we invented the wheel to roll places, which is fascinating. We have had materials for a very long time, and our ability to use them got more sophisticated, but more likely, we got integrated technologies. We figured out how to combine things that made that material useful in a new way. On this chart, I have global population at the top, and for some reason I put US population at the bottom. I can't quite figure out why I thought that mattered. Many of our most useful materials in today's world we've been using for centuries, for millennia in some cases. Iron is a good example. Steel is just iron that we figured out how to carbonize to make stronger, to make better weapons. Plastic we think of as a very new material, but there are things that are plastic from nature. Lacquer is a good example, that we could mold and form long before we figured out a synthetic laboratory version of that. This cause and effect is really evident with coal. We figured out how coal could make a hotter fire than wood, and then when you put stuff in that hotter fire, it can be transformed. So we figured out glass. We figured out different methods of smelting metals. I put kites on this chart not because they're cute and fun to fly, but because when you scale up a kite and put a human on it, you get flight, you get human flight. And there's such a difference between dreaming of flight and knowing that it could happen, that to me that actually seems like a really important moment in early discursive design. In 200 BC, paper was invented in China, and very, very soon after in Korea, sort of simultaneous situation there. It didn't arrive in Europe for over 1,000 years. So think about all of the innovations that were shared by people who could write it down and have paper, and all of the ignorance that was perpetuated by the people who couldn't. Paper allows better communication. Better communication allows organization and government. Government allows unification of different tribes and regions. Unification allows empire, which is good and bad, but certainly there is progress involved in that. With the fall of Rome, the West was plunged into an age of ignorance and darkness, but in China, toilet paper was invented. Can you imagine the world without toilet paper? I mean, sadly, you probably can because the last 6 months asked you to do that. But there's such a beautiful sort of ebbing and flowing of innovation throughout history. In the 800s, China standardized the pre-existing written language and reduced a really complicated variable system to 200 graphic modules that could be used to make over 50,000 characters. It's a beautiful example of modular thinking really early. And that standardized language was part of what helped unify China and guarantee all of the innovation that was happening there. It created a stable society at a time when the rest of the world was not really able to arrive at stability. And when you get printing on paper, you can share that original source document or image many more times with many more people. You can also make paper money. You can uncouple value. So instead of a coin being gold, and that's what defines its value, you could have a government saying this piece of paper is worth something. And right after you invent printed paper money, you also then invent inflation. When the West woke up again with the Renaissance and invented movable type printing, which was really just Chinese printing with some metal casting added to it, tons of stuff started to spread. So in the same way that China was unified through printing, all of the rest of the world started to share ideas and make this kind of incremental progress because information could be shared. So that's why the end of this chart has this huge explosion. Once you get global sharing of ideas, you get this kind of progress. Once you get power added to old innovation, you can scale everything up. Once you get farming of food and better medicine and distribution, you get this population explosion. Just to put this in a little bit of perspective, the actual profession of industrial design is just this tiny little slice at the end. And when I took this class a long time ago, it was 1945 to 1980, and that was it. It's all we were allowed to know about because that was the profession. I think that does such a disservice to everything, to us, to our brains, to our curiosity, to our accomplishments. So for me, expanding the study of industrial design to all the way back is a really important part of understanding how to do it better today. Also, we cannot imagine living without electricity. If the power goes out, we're sunk. We can't do anything. Electricity isn't even the whole of this period of explosive innovation at the end of my chart. It's only part of it. So could we live without electricity? Of course. We were incredibly innovative without it. Most of us can no longer imagine living without the internet. And look at what a tiny, tiny little slice of this equation it is. The internet, in fact, is so small that I take up more space on this timeline than the internet. Most of my students take up less time than the internet. And the little slice that tyrannically rules our life now, the Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, is so incredibly tiny and small. I find that really reassuring because it means that this is a temporary situation, useful for some reasons, terrible for others, ephemeral like everything else. So what we're going to do in the next couple of weeks is dive deeply into these earlier eras of innovation that work to support the stuff we're supposed to talk about that's actually part of this profession. Adam Smith, who was a Scottish moral philosopher and a political economist, wrote, "Utility is one of the principal sources of beauty. The fitness of any system or machine to produce the end for which it was intended bestows a certain propriety and beauty upon the whole and renders the very thought and contemplation of it agreeable." For centuries, Design was focused on just, does it work? Does it do what I need it to do? We weren't really thinking about also making things, functional things, beautiful. So that relationship between craft and manufacturing, we're going to look at a lot this semester. But I wanted to put Adam Smith in here just to point out that utility is a really, really important part of what we're going to look at for the next 2 weeks of content. In 2 weeks, we'll look at the Industrial Revolution, which was spurred on by an explosion of innovation and the harnessing of power sources, adding power to existing technologies. But much of the thinking that made up the innovation of the Industrial Revolution had been around for a really long time. So for me, starting with the Industrial Revolution also seems wrong, and that's where most industrial design history classes would start. But I feel like the brain power in evidence earlier, the problem solving, has so much to offer us that I want to spend more time looking at it. So take a break, have some ice cream, practice some jumping rope, and come back for a deep plunge into early innovation and engineering and considering how much of today's world was already in evidence a really long time ago. Okay, thanks. Motorcycles. It's so hot with the windows closed.